In December 1941, a British raiding unit that had, by any reasonable military assessment, already failed once and should have been disbanded, drove out into the Libyan desert to make one final case for its own existence. A month earlier, this same unit had parachuted into a storm, lost two-thirds of its men, and destroyed not a single enemy aircraft. Now, in trucks borrowed from another unit entirely, it was about to strike three Axis airfields along the same stretch of coast, Sirte, Agheila and Agedabia, in a tightly coordinated series of raids that would leave dozens of German and Italian aircraft in flames, and would do it without losing a single man to enemy action. This is the story of what the Special Air Service actually did to those three airfields, what went right, what went wrong even on a night largely remembered as a triumph, and why the numbers that came out of this operation, 61 Axis aircraft destroyed against effectively zero SAS combat losses, became the proof of concept that kept the entire regiment alive. To understand the stakes of this raid, you need to understand exactly how precarious the SAS's position was in the weeks after Operation Squatter. That first mission, a parachute assault against airfields near Agheila on the night of 16-17 November 1941, had been catastrophic. 52 men had jumped into a storm considered one of the worst the region had seen in decades. Only 21 made it back to friendly lines. Not one enemy aircraft had been destroyed. For a unit with no combat record to point to and a founder, David Stirling, who had bypassed the normal chain of command to get the SAS approved in the first place, this was close to a death sentence. Senior officers who had already been skeptical of an unconventional raiding concept now had a costly, unsuccessful first mission as evidence that their skepticism had been justified. What kept the unit alive in the immediate aftermath was less institutional patience and more sheer distraction. The wider British offensive, Operation Crusader, was in full swing, and 8th Army's senior commanders had considerably larger problems occupying their attention than the fate of one small experimental unit. Stirling used that window to make the single most important tactical decision of the SAS's early history. He abandoned parachute insertion for raiding missions almost entirely and turned instead to the long-range desert group, the LRDG, a small reconnaissance unit that had spent more than a year mastering exactly the kind of deep desert vehicle navigation that Operation Squatter had shown the SAS still lacked. The plan that emerged called for small raiding parties, each transporting and guided by an LRDG patrol, to strike Axis airfields along the Libyan coast on foot, exactly as originally intended, but this time delivered to their targets dry, rested, and with their explosives intact, rather than scattered across miles of open desert by a parachute drop gone wrong. There would be no room for a second failure of anything like the scale of Operation Squatter. This mission had to work. In early December 1941, Stirling organized his surviving force into several small raiding parties. Stirling himself would lead one group, targeting the airfield at Sirte. Jock Lewes, one of the unit's founding officers and the inventor of the small time-delay demolition charge that bore his name, the Lewes bomb, would lead a party toward Agheila. Paddy Mayne, already gaining a reputation as one of the unit's most formidable and unpredictable soldiers, would strike the airfield at Wadi Tamet, along the same general stretch of coast. A separate party, later joined by Lieutenant Bill Fraser, would be tasked with the airfield complex at Agedabia, roughly 75 aircraft strong, according to intelligence gathered in the days before the attack. Getting to these targets was itself an ordeal. LRDG trucks, painted in a distinctive and slightly absurd pink and green camouflage scheme designed to blend into the desert terrain, carried the raiding parties across hundreds of miles of open ground, dealing with the routine mechanical breakdowns, flat tires, and navigational challenges that came with operating so far from any supply depot. It took the better part of a week of hard travel simply to reach the vicinity of the target airfields, a stark contrast to the swift, dramatic strike the unit had originally envisioned when parachutes were still part of the plan. By mid-December, the various parties were in position, ready to move on foot the final distance to their individual targets under cover of darkness. Precisely the kind of approach Operation Squatter had promised and never delivered. Stirling's own raid, aimed at the airfield near Sirte, is the part of this story that legend tends to leave out, and it is worth including precisely because it complicates the narrative of a flawless night. Approaching the airfield in darkness, Stirling's small party ran into difficulty almost immediately. According to accounts from men who were there, Stirling, moving carefully through the darkened airfield perimeter, accidentally stepped directly on a sleeping Italian sentry. The startled soldier cried out in pain, and the element of surprise that the entire raid depended on collapsed instantly. Panicked Italian guards began firing into the darkness, though in the confusion they fired out toward the sea rather than at the actual raiding party, allowing Stirling's men to withdraw into the desert without casualties. The raid on Sirte, in other words, did not succeed in its stated objective. No aircraft were destroyed there that night. Stirling's group instead watched from a distance the following day as the airfield's now thoroughly alarmed pilots flew their aircraft away rather than risk leaving them parked overnight again. It is a useful corrective to the version of this story that sometimes circulates as an unbroken run of SAS success. Even during the operation that effectively saved the unit's existence, one of its three primary targets, led by its own founding commander, ended in an accidental compromise and 0 aircraft destroyed. Jock Lewes's party, moving toward the airfield at Agheila, encountered a different kind of disappointment, one that had nothing to do with tactical error and everything to do with incomplete intelligence. When Lewes's men reached the airfield after careful approach, they found it essentially empty. Whatever aircraft intelligence reports had suggested would be there simply were not present, likely having already been relocated or dispersed elsewhere along the Libyan coast in the days before the raid. Rather than return with nothing to show for the effort, at least one account from a member of the raiding party describes the group adapting on the spot, turning the mission into an impromptu strafing operation against Axis road traffic in the area instead, engaging isolated vehicles and smaller convoys where the opportunity presented itself, while avoiding heavier concentrations of enemy transport that posed too great a risk to a small raiding party operating alone, deep in hostile territory. No airfield victory came out of Agheila that night, but the episode says something important about how this new generation of SAS raiding parties operated compared to the rigid, single-objective planning of Operation Squatter. When the primary target evaporated, the raiders adapted in the field rather than simply withdrawing empty-handed, a flexibility that would become as central to the unit's later reputation as any single successful demolition job. If Sirte was a stumble and Agheila a disappointment, Wadi Tamet, struck by Paddy Mayne's party, was where the entire operation earned its place in SAS history. Mayne led a small group of roughly half a dozen men onto the airfield perimeter under cover of darkness and began working methodically down the parked rows of German and Italian aircraft, attaching Lewis bombs to as many as his limited supply would allow. When the explosive charges ran out before the aircraft did, accounts of the raid describe Mayne resorting to raw physical destruction, tearing instrument panels and cockpit controls out of the remaining parked aircraft with his bare hands rather than leave them intact and repairable. By the time his party withdrew, roughly 24 enemy aircraft, along with fuel stores and other equipment at the airfield, had been destroyed. Mayne's group suffered no casualties in the raid itself. At the prearranged rendezvous with the LRDG afterward, Mayne reported the full tally to Stirling, whose own party had just spent the previous night failing to achieve anything at all at Sirte, a contrast that did a great deal to establish Mayne's reputation within the unit almost overnight. The most productive single strike of this entire campaign came roughly a week later, when Lieutenant Bill Fraser led a small party of just 4 men, Jeff Duvivier, Jock Lewes, Arthur Phillips, and Bob Tate, at least 2 of whom had survived the disaster of Operation Squatter only weeks earlier, against the sprawling airfield complex at Agedabia, reported by intelligence at the time to hold as many as 75 German and Italian aircraft. Moving into position roughly 16 miles from the airfield in the early hours of 21 December, Fraser's small team spent the daylight hours of the 21st observing the target from a concealed position before making their final approach on foot after dark, exactly as the original SAS concept had envisioned all along. Working through the parked ranks of aircraft under cover of night, Fraser's men placed their remaining demolition charges with the same methodical approach Mayne's party had used at Tamet. Fraser's own after-action report, credited by Stirling in the recommendation that followed, claimed 37 enemy aircraft destroyed, along with a bomb dump and fuel supplies, and described the party withdrawing without loss despite enemy patrols attempting to intercept them on the way out. It's worth noting, in the interest of historical accuracy, that some later researchers examining wartime Axis wreck count records have suggested the true number of aircraft actually destroyed at Agedabia may have been somewhat lower than the 37 originally claimed, closer, by some estimates, to around 25 confirmed wrecks, with the remainder likely accounted for by aircraft already damaged in earlier RAF strafing attacks on the same airfield earlier that December. Even by the more conservative estimate, it remained one of the most productive single raids of the unit's early history. There was one further, sobering detail attached to this otherwise successful raid, and it deserves to be included rather than left out for the sake of a cleaner story. On the return journey, 2 soldiers from the East Kent Regiment attached to the supporting LRDG patrol, Lawrence Ashby and Reginald Riggs, were killed not by enemy action, but by friendly fire from an RAF aircraft that misidentified their vehicles. It is a reminder that even an operation remembered correctly as a triumph for the raiding parties themselves was not without cost to the men supporting them. Add together what actually happened across this string of raids in December 1941, Sirte's failed approach, El Agheila's empty airfield, Tamet's roughly 2 dozen destroyed aircraft, and Agedabia's several dozen more, and the total most commonly cited across historical sources lands at around 61 Axis aircraft destroyed, for the loss of no SAS personnel to enemy action during any of the actual airfield assaults themselves. That figure mattered far more than its raw size might suggest. Operation Squatter had given senior British commanders every reason to conclude that Stirling's concept, however clever on paper, simply didn't survive contact with reality. This new run of raids, executed within weeks of that failure using an entirely different method of insertion, gave Stirling something no amount of argument or persuasion could have provided on its own. Proof, in the form of burning aircraft and after-action reports that Stirling himself could forward up the chain of command, that the underlying idea had been sound all along, provided it was delivered by the right method. It is also worth being honest about what this operation was not. It was not a single flawless night, despite how cleanly the story is sometimes told in retrospect. One of its 3 primary targets produced no destroyed aircraft at all because of an accidental compromise by the mission's own commander. Another produced no destroyed aircraft because the intelligence about what would be there was simply wrong. The raid that is remembered today as one of the SAS's founding triumphs was, in reality, a mixed outcome redeemed by 2 genuinely devastating strikes at Tamet and Agedabia. And even those 2 successes came with a cost, paid by 2 soldiers who were never part of the raiding parties at all, killed by their own side's aircraft on the way home. That mixed, imperfect record is, if anything, more instructive than the clean version of the story. The SAS's survival in December 1941 did not depend on every part of the plan working. It depended on enough of it working in the right places at the right moments to give Stirling the evidence he needed, and on a raiding method built around vehicles rather than parachutes that had finally removed the single point of failure that had doomed the unit's first attempt a month earlier. 61 aircraft, spread across 3 airfields and roughly a week of hard desert travel, is the number history remembers. What actually happened at Sirte, El Agheila, and Agedabia is a more complicated and ultimately more honest story about how a nearly disbanded unit found just enough success in just enough places to prove that its founding idea deserved a second chance.